good in the debates. Ask Biden.
Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are simply too extreme for the American people.
Kamala Harris fights for abortion rights, so I fight for Kamala Harris.
Israel and Iran-backed Hezbollah fighters on Sunday had their biggest exchange of fire since conflict broke out in the region 10 months ago.
It is incumbent on all parties in the region to work towards de-escalation and stability.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. 71 days until Election Day, because I know you're keeping track at home, and as a result, both candidates are, not surprisingly, hitting the road this week. Today, former President Trump made a visit to Arlington National Cemetery to mark 3 years since the Abbey Gate bombing in Afghanistan. And Trump delivered remarks to the National Guard Association in Detroit. This while Vice President Kamala Harris is looking to keep the convention momentum going and even expand it if she can with a bus tour of Georgia. That starts Wednesday. Her campaign is also responding to Trump's challenge that he might skip the debate currently scheduled for September 10th. Here to break down all the campaign news is our political director, Fin Gomez, here at the table, and Jeff Ame, who covers Georgia politics and government for the Associated Press. Fin, I want to start with you. Is Trump and this questioning of whether or not the September 10th debate will or will not happen internet clickbait, a head fake, or something serious?
It's more like a game of political chicken, if you will, like with only 15 days out to this first debate that they had agreed to. And if you remember, like leading to this point, there was a lot of back and forth, especially coming from the Trump side, on whether he'd do it. Now it's like essentially it's posturing and positioning, and it's this battle over, in part, hot mics, right? Like whether they'll allow the mics to be on throughout the duration of the 90-minute debate. But again, it's a lot of moves, a lot of tactics. Let's see how it ends up.
So just to remind the audience, in the negotiations with the Biden campaign, back when there was a Biden campaign, the negotiating position of that campaign, Biden's campaign, was mute button. Your mic is only on when you are talking. The Harris campaign says, no, keep the mics open. It's fine. Why? Because it appears the Harris campaign is calculated. Trump will try to talk over her. That will not work out for him, and it will work to her net advantage.
A backlash. If you recall that second debate during the 2020 cycle, there was that backlash where he essentially jumped all over Biden, and essentially you saw that in the aftermath of that debate. And so they see that as maybe a political advantage to them. This is a new position, though, from the Harris campaign. This was not, like as you said, this was not part of the Biden team initial negotiations.
Of course, the Harris campaign would say, we didn't negotiate with President Biden. We're the campaign now. There's
someone new on the top of the ticket, right? and also, I mean, but the Trump campaign is saying, look, we agreed to the CNN debate rules, the now infamous CNN debate from June 27th, right? But like we're going back to that model. Like you're the ones who are changing this. But again, I think we'll see some more maneuvering in the next 15 days.
I'm going to give you a moment to put your earpiece in because you're going to hear former President Trump talk about this during a stop in Falls Church, Virginia, earlier today. Let's take a quick listen.
I think ABC should be shut out. I'd much rather do it on NBC. I'd much rather do it on CBS, frankly. I think CBS is very unfair, but the best of the group. And certainly I'd do it on Fox. I'd even do it on CNN. I thought CNN treated us very fairly the last time. I think Jake Tapper was very fair and Dana Bash was very fair. But when I watched this interview of Tom Cotton, fortunately he's a total pro, he knows what he's doing. And then when I watched the roundtable after that, I said the hostility is crazy. So we're thinking about it.
We're thinking about it. Let's just give, for the audience's benefit, Finn, a little bit of backstory about ABC. There is a lawsuit from Trump about ABC, about allegations of defamation. There is also this stirring cauldron in the conservative echo chamber about Dana Walden, a senior Disney executive who oversees the news division within Disney, longtime friend of Kamala Harris's. Her husband and Doug Emhoff, even longer friends.
They're close.
And this is like, well, how can that possibly be? This objectivity, would ABC be fair? That's all stirring the pot as well.
Yeah, I mean, and he did. Look, Trump went after, ABC News after Sunday, after that, after their Sunday show, and this week, and I think part of it is that. I mean, he feels like he's getting an unfair look by them. I will say that I think that CBS News has the best debates, hands down. I'm biased here, but I do think we do offer the
Quite
best debates.
agree.
And we do have a big VP debate coming up.
But look, this thing's going to happen. It's going to happen on September 10th, and it's going to happen on ABC. And all this is, it seems to me, just a lot of razzle-dazzle to try to get some headlines. I want to bring in Jeff Ame.
Political game of chicken.
Who covers politics and government in Georgia. Jeff, I want to talk to you about something that's happened this afternoon relative to the potential ballot status of RFK Jr., Jill Stein, and Cornel West. What's the latest in Georgia on that, if you can?
This afternoon, an administrative law judge issued a ruling that said that RFK Jr., Cornel West, Jill Stein, and Claudia de la Cruz should not be able to appear on Georgia ballots this fall. He said that none of them qualified. This is not the final word. These are findings that go ahead to Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, who then must make his own final ruling. That has to happen pretty quick. Georgia is going to send out military and overseas ballots beginning September 17th. Raffensperger's office told me today that they're going to rule on each of these candidates as quickly as they can.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that update, Jeff. I want to talk to you about something that former President Trump said about Georgia Republican Governor Brian Kemp earlier in August. Let's play that soundbite. Then I want to ask you about how they've tried, that is to say, Trump patched things up with Kemp. But let's listen to the sound first.
And Brian Kemp, your governor, who I got elected, by the way. If it wasn't for me, he would not be your governor. I think everybody knows that. He's a very disloyal person, isn't he? Very disloyal. But these two are doing
disloyal. Jeff, what's the status, as best you can tell, of the Kemp-Trump relationship now? It seems like it's gotten a second look.
Brian Kemp, for his own reasons, needs to be a loyal supporter of the Republican ticket this fall. Brian Kemp has future political ambitions. That could be U.S. Senate in 26, could even be running for president in 2028. And none of that may happen if he is seen to abandon Donald Trump and leave him to flounder in Georgia. So for Kemp's own reasons, he has declined to basically play the feud with President Trump. And so last week, as most of the nation was watching Vice President Harris give her acceptance speech, Brian Kemp appeared on Fox News and said some nice things about Donald Trump. And then Donald Trump posted on social media that he was happy with Brian Kemp and that basically all was forgiven. So what that seems to say right now is that Brian Kemp will be providing some level of assistance to try to help Donald Trump win Georgia's 16 electoral votes. But that honestly was the situation even before this exchange of niceties last week.
Right.
Brian Kemp had never really altered his position that he was going to support the Republican nominee and that he was going to do what he could to get Donald Trump elected.
Jeff, let me talk to you about the ground game in Georgia. When I spoke to Governor Kemp in Milwaukee at the Republican National Convention, he said he didn't think the Trump campaign was sufficiently well organized on the ground in Georgia and thought that they really had some catch-up to do. It appears now that the Harris-Walz campaign is enjoying a bit of momentum in Georgia, as it is elsewhere, organizing on the ground. How would you assess the two campaigns at this stage?
The Democrats have been telling us for months that they are going to out-organize the Republicans. It is not really clear. I do continue to hear from Republicans that they are worried about this. I mostly hear from Republicans who are close to Brian Kemp that they're worried about this. Kemp was seen as having an excellent ground game, especially in his 2022 reelection, where he pretty handily beat Democrat Stacey Abrams. And so there's some question of basically whether Brian Kemp is going to give the keys to the car to Donald Trump and give him the benefit of his organization statewide. For that to happen, beyond the question of whether Brian Kemp and Donald Trump are getting along, I think it's a question of money, because that kind of statewide organizing costs millions of dollars. And I'm just not sure whether Brian Kemp is going to spend out of his own pocket, out of his own political resources, the kind of money that's needed to stand up an entire statewide organization.
With the national, go ahead, Jeff.
I'm sorry. For now, he's mostly concentrating on competitive state legislative districts, of which there are sort of a double-sized handful, mostly around Metro Atlanta.
Very good. With a national perspective, Finn Gomez with a drill down on Georgia, the all-important Georgia. Jeff Ami, thank you very much. Special counsel Jack Smith has filed his appeal in the Trump classified documents case ahead of tomorrow's deadline. Smith has asked the federal appeals court to reverse Judge Eileen Cannon's decision to dismiss the underlying case. Last month, Cannon did that, dismissed the charges against former President Trump, ruling that special counsel Smith was improperly appointed. Former president has been charged with 40 counts of illegally retaining classified information and obstructing government efforts to retrieve that material from his Mar-a-Lago home in Florida. Israel and Hezbollah exchanged heavy fire over the weekend, while mediators try to preserve ceasefire talks aimed at ending the war in Gaza. The latest from the region, that is next. You are streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Over the weekend, there was yet another escalation of violence in the Middle East. Israel and the Iranian-backed militant group Hezbollah had their largest exchange of fire since the war in Gaza broke out. According to the Israeli military, the IDF lost one soldier and killed 6 members of Hezbollah. The strikes ended by mid-morning Sunday. Both sides assert that they only aimed at militarily relevant targets. CBS News foreign correspondent Imtiaz Tayeb joins us live from Tel Aviv. Imtiaz, catch us up. What is the latest right now?
Yeah, Major, I'm actually going to turn the clock back to the 31st of July when Israel carried out a targeted strike in an area of Beirut called Dahya, killing a senior Hezbollah commander, a man by the name of Fouad Shukr. In fact, we were in Beirut when that happened. We rushed to the scene, and it was very clear that Hezbollah would avenge his death. And yet, here we are nearly 4 weeks later, and Hezbollah has carried out its strike. But as we saw, Israel carried out what it described as a preemptive strike, targeting what it said was thousands of Hezbollah missile barrels in 40 sites across southern Lebanon. Still, Hezbollah fired over 300 rockets into Israeli territories, as well as several drones. And as we've been saying, at least 6 Hezbollah fighters were killed, and at least 1 Israeli soldier was killed. Still, having said all of that, both Israel and Hezbollah are saying that their strikes were successful and that, at least for the moment, the situation is contained. Major.
Contained for the moment. All right. Catch us up, Imtiaz, on the status, such as they are, of the long-running ceasefire negotiations between Israel and Hamas in Cairo.
Yeah, good question. And so long running, and of course, incredibly painful for the people in Gaza who are so desperate for the violence there to end, and indeed for hostage families who are so desperate to be reunited with their loved ones. Now, many people had hoped that on Sunday, when you had the Israeli delegation there, the Hamas delegation there, senior U.S. officials, including the head of the CIA in Cairo for those talks, as well as the Qataris and the Egyptians, many had hoped that we would see a breakthrough, but we did not see a breakthrough. However, we do understand what's being described as low-level talks remain in Cairo, trying to fill in what's being described as the gaps between Israel and Hamas. One of those key gaps is Hamas's demand that Israel fully withdraw from Gaza. Whatever the case, tonight we're hearing from a senior White House spokesman who has said that Israel and Hezbollah's massive cross-border strikes against each other did not impact the Gaza ceasefire and hostage release negotiations that are underway in Cairo, saying progress is being made and that the talks remain constructive.
And Jez, I want to ask you about one aspect of life in Gaza because it seems worth talking about for a moment. Israel's military says that polio vaccines have arrived there, that is to say Gaza, after the first confirmed case of polio in a quarter century. How do you vaccinate children for polio in an area as war-torn as Gaza and where people are having to move all the time, over and over and over, to avoid more violence?
Yeah, it's such an incredibly important point that you make, Major, and the short answer is aid agencies don't have an answer to that. In fact, all they've been doing is asking Israel to pause the violence so that they can distribute these polio vaccination. In fact, we understand that in the last 24 hours, aid agencies in Gaza have received over 1 million vaccinations, which would be enough for all the children in Gaza. Think about it, Major. There are over 1 million children in Gaza who have essentially been living under frankly, terrible conditions. But we do understand that there has been at least one confirmed case of polio affecting a 10-month-old baby boy who is now paralyzed from his left leg downward. The fear is that we will see many more cases like this if health workers are not able to distribute these vaccinations across the Gaza Strip. And as we've been saying, the violence there continues. In fact, over this weekend alone, over 200 Palestinians have been killed in Israeli strikes. Major.
MTS Tayeb in Tel Aviv for us. Thank you very, very much. The bipartisan House task force investigating last month's failed assassination attempt of former President Trump visits the scene where that attack occurred. We've got more on their trip to Butler, Pennsylvania. That's next. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Thanks for staying with us. A House task force investigating the assassination attempt on former President Trump is vowing to restore Americans' confidence in the overall safety of elected officials. Members of the bipartisan group visited the site where the shooting took place. That was in Butler, Pennsylvania. And the heads of the task force reaffirmed their mission to get to answers about that shooting.
There's not one person on this conference that's identifying just as a Republican or a Democrat. We're identifying as members of Congress on a task force with a task to restore the faith and trust and confidence the American people have to have in our system.
That you don't have to be a Democrat or a Republican or an unaffiliated to say that there's no room for political violence in America.
Scott McFarland joins us from the White House. Scott, what is the takeaway from today's visit to Butler, Pennsylvania, or is there one?
Yeah, a few of the top lines here, Major, is how far and wide this congressional investigation has gotten already. They've been briefed by the FBI. They've talked with the Secret Service. They've interviewed local police, state police that were part of the response. And they now have sights set on interviewing rally-goers, people who attended that event. And they have talked about possibly issuing subpoenas, a power which Congress has given them, as they continue this investigation. Now, there are several investigations, Major, into July 13th. The Secret Service has its own internal review. The FBI is lead in the probe. But Congress set up this task force, which has two distinctive characteristics. First of all, it must release publicly some amount of its findings, some final report. It has to do so by the end of the year, before this Congress ends. And typically, Congress is, to put it charitably, Major, an imperfect vehicle for investigations because they often have partisan stripes to them. But this one has so far been different. The group that spoke before reporters in Butler, Pennsylvania today had Democrats and Republicans working collaboratively, speaking collaboratively, congenially, and they, at this point, have given off the image of a true bipartisan commission.
What are they still curious about, Scott? What are the questions they're looking for answers to?
Well, some of this is the same baseline question we all have, the FBI and Secret Service have. How can something so significant go wrong in such a high-profile place? Why was the higher ground not accounted for? Why was that building's roof left exposed and vulnerable? They have the same questions about Secret Service protocols, whether they should have used the drone, talked better to local police. But Congress, of course, has a different role. Congress is in charge of funding Secret Service, of authorizing Secret Service missions. They may be looking into what type of resources need to be available in the future. Congress would be the ones to make it available, and also potentially, Major, to authorize changes to Secret Service missions. They do control the purse strings, which makes their investigation uniquely important.
As you well remember, Scott, in the immediate aftermath, there was some conversation about whether there had been requests from the Trump campaign for additional Secret Service resources, whether those got all the way up to the chain of command. Were they affirmed? Were they denied? The Secret Service issued a couple of conflicting statements about that. Is the committee, the bipartisan committee looking into this, is that at the upper level of their areas of curiosity still?
We know members of Congress are interested in that, and it brings up an interesting issue, and one thing that has sprouted from this committee that maybe some people didn't expect. Louisiana Republican Clay Higgins, a deep devotee of Donald Trump's, is a member of this panel and issued his own unilateral standalone report of findings last week, which questioned the FBI and somehow the FBI has handled its role. Other members of the task force would not comment on Mr. Higgins' report when we asked them, and Mr. Higgins was among the very few who was not at that microphone today. So let's see what questions all of the task force has versus what questions some of the task force has, and how long they can remain, at least relatively speaking, politically cohesive.
And just to double back on this, Scott, the intent is to have something for the public to consume by the end of this calendar year?
That's right. These special committees set up by the Congress have to finish their work before the Congress ends, which, of course, is January 2nd, January 3rd, 2025. So their final report would have to be issued before then. If you recall, the House January 6th Select Committee issued its final report with just hours remaining in that Congress at the very start of 2023.
Scott, before I let you go, the Secret Service has placed at least 5 agents who were there on Butler, Pennsylvania on administrative leave. Is that of concern to this committee? Was it something discussed today?
It's a concern among some Republicans in Congress who say that if it's going to be administrative leave, if there's going to be some action taken against those responsible or those under review for being responsible for July 13th, that should have happened immediately. It should have happened promptly, not 6 weeks later. Haven't heard a lot of criticisms from Congress that anybody would be put on administrative leave during a review.
Scott McFarlane at the White House with all the details. Thank you so very much. Will they or won't they debate, as the presidential campaign spar over whether microphones should or should not be muted? Our political panel will weigh into this super heavy issue when we get back. And there'll be other campaign news. You're streaming America Decides.
But Susan, this is important,
Susan,
and I want to add. But if, Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking. I'm speaking.
Welcome back to America Decides. That was back in 2020, and Kamala Harris clearly was not afraid to talk over Mike Pence when he interrupted her during their debate. But when President Biden debated former President Trump in June, you might remember the candidates' mics were muted while the other candidates spoke. The Harris campaign wants them back on for the whole debate scheduled for September 10th. Among our topics will be this and many others, I promise. We're not going to dwell on this, but we're going to get to it. Let's bring in our political panel, Dave Weigel and Laura Davison. Dave is politics reporter for Semaphore. Laura is a politics editor for Bloomberg. All right, lightning round very quickly. Give me your thoughts on the debate itself, its likely occurrence on September 10th with ABC and the mics.
I think it's clear what Harris wants from a open mic situation, which is Donald Trump over-talking himself, showing up more like he did at the first Biden debate in 2020. And I don't think that there's another turning point that they can control until the debate, because the Trump campaign has spent a lot of time and effort investing in Kamala Harris as a lightweight who can't handle him. And she needs to show up as somebody who can, because the last Democratic nominee showed up and had to end their campaign.
Exactly. Laura?
I think it's a real question of if this debate happens at all.
You're on the not... It may not happen.
You know, Trump has said he didn't want to debate. Then he came out and held a press conference saying he wanted to debate. In fact, he wanted to debate 3 times. And now he's saying he's not sure he wants to debate. So this is 2 weeks away. A lot can happen in there. But it's clear that Harris's camp is more interested in debating than Trump's, at least right now.
Who needs it more right now, Dave, from your perspective?
I do think the vice president needs it more, not as much as Biden did. Biden was losing and needed something to turn that around. He needed to convince a certain number of voters that he was not told to be president. Didn't work, obviously. Harris does. She's doing a lot better on every metric than Biden was, but she has not faced Donald Trump one-on-one. And to the extent there's a consistent Trump message in the last few weeks, it has been she can't handle questions, she can't handle spontaneity. How could she handle a foreign leader when she's only taking a few questions on a tarmac or something like that? Harris showing up and doing about as good as Biden did first debate 2020, I think solves a lot of her remaining problems. And also getting 90 minutes to debate her record on stage. You saw this with Biden walking off the stage realizing he'd lost to Trump. If you can't litigate it in those 90 minutes, some issues just sort of fall off the chart.
And Laura, it seems that the Harris campaign is saying, as a former prosecutor, she's willing and eager to litigate. She wants this opportunity.
Yes, I mean, and she is, her process for this, when she was in the Senate on the Judiciary Committee, she came in very prepared. She would practice all these things, and she would land a lot of zingers. Where she's less comfortable is in the sort of unscripted back and forth. That's probably why we haven't seen her go out and do a major interview yet. That is where Trump thrives. So she views it very much as an academic exercise. He views a debate as an entertainer. So they approach this from a little bit different perspectives.
Dave, from your vantage point, where does this campaign sit right now? Net plus for Harris or even Steven?
I would say even, and especially because we have the uncertainty of both what she got from the convention and what happens to the remainder of Kennedy voters. If you're the Trump campaign, you're very talking to them today, very confident that that got you the margin in Pennsylvania at the moment that would put you ahead there, got you the margin in North Carolina, that they still think they've got as of today, a map that's just over 270 and Democrats don't, but very close. And they made a lot of decisions for quite a long time based on the assumption that it was going to be Joe Biden and that before Harris' switch that he was doomed. And you can see they're the people readjusting a lot now, where Democrats are not. They're the ones who have to deal with a new front in the Sun Belt, North Carolina, Arizona, et cetera. They feel that they're winning in that, but they were dominating in that a month ago.
Laura, your sense of the campaign as it sits right now?
They're not sure what their messaging is. The Trump campaign is not sure what their messaging is. You see Trump out there doing a lot of personal attacks against Harris, going after her race, her gender, her intelligence, and he's saying in public, my advisors are pleading with me, not to go on these personal attacks, but and then he literally polls his audience and says, do you want me to go with the personal attacks? Do you not? And he gets bigger cheers when he wants to, for going on these personal insults. So this is where you see sort of the tension between where the campaign wants him to be. So they're setting up all these events to talk specifically about the economy, about the border, about migration, but still he's veering off script and talking about the late great Hannibal Lecter, electric boats and sharks and other things that they'd prefer him not go there.
Where do you come down on this meta question? Who's the incumbent and who's the challenger in this race, Dave?
It's a great question because they're both getting away with some sort of reintroduction right now. Right. Harris more so. Harris, and Democratic polling backed this up before they switched candidates. For whatever reason, a lot of voters don't associate with her with everything Joe Biden did. That she had an opening on inflation, which she's taken to the frustration of the Trump campaign. The Trump campaign, though, this is a former president who is running as the anti-establishment, break up the uniparty candidate with the Kennedy introduction with Tulsi Gabbard endorsing him today. And these are marginal for a lot of people, but I like the way that Charlie Kirk, the Turning Point USA president who has a show, was putting it is this is now the party of unity, of national unity versus the Democratic uniparty. That's all the deep state Republicans that we don't like anymore. It's Liz Cheney. It's Kamala Harris.
All the Bushies, Romney people.
Right. Which might be an argument that makes more sense in their space, but it only makes sense because one-term President Donald Trump is still running as somebody who the establishment wants to keep out of power. But I do think Harris has that was clear that Trump would try that, and he did that in the whole Republican primary. For this to succeed for even a couple weeks for Harris, I think is a little bit surprising.
Who's the incumbent? Who's the challenger from your vantage point?
When you ask voters, people know Trump way more than they know what Harris is about. That, of course, has positives and negatives. Of everybody knows who Trump is, what he stands for. Harris is lesser known, which gives her an opportunity to brand herself, and that's what we saw her do last week at the DNC. This is what we see Trump sort of trying to figure out how to brand her, what names to call her. He landed, I think, on Comrade Kamala, but that was after throwing out a bunch of stuff that was not really sticking to the wall. And even still, then he has to really kind of explain that he hasn't really been able to land the zingers in the way he's wanted to. Giving Harris now 5 weeks to go out and make a case to voters.
Dave, there's a headline in the New York Times this weekend: "Joy is not a strategy." Mm-hmm. But joy is part of the zeitgeist, and clearly in Chicago, you two saw this. The idea was politics can be different, can feel different, and if you want different and feel better, go this direction. Mm-hmm. Is that enough?
Well, that gets to what you were saying about how they're able to run this campaign. Donald Trump is not the incumbent, but Donald Trump is still commanding people's attention a lot of the time, and for 50-some% of the country, that used to be 60%, but now it's 50% of the country. That's exhausting. And there are things that would go away if Donald Trump did not run a political party anymore. Is that the most policy-driven argument? No, they have other policy parts of the argument. But that's how I interpret those remarks, is that there is something, material in the electorate that exists because Donald Trump will not go away. We are the party that can make him go away. Maybe it wasn't credible when Joe Biden said it, but it beat this guy twice and it's credible. They've gotten pretty far with that argument, but I think that's what it means.
I mean, it is a sort of gut emotional thing. If you're tired of or exhausted, or you're just done with the familiarity you have, and maybe it's a fading fad, I don't know. But if you're done with Trumpism, this is an alternative that is fresher, newer. That seems to be a kind of a very simple distillation of the Harris message.
Yeah, if like money can't buy happiness, joy can't buy an election, but it can solve a lot of problems. It helps with donors and voters want to bet on a winner, someone they see who has momentum, see a fresh face. So that's why you see the campaign really touting. She's raised, just in the past, month or so, $540 million. That's essentially what it took the Biden 2020 campaign. That was half of what they raised during the entirety of their run. So it's a huge amount of money. They have all these volunteers coming in, and they only have to run for just a little bit over 2 months. You can sustain that in a way that you really can't for 18 months.
Laura Davis, Dave Weigel, a pleasure. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
A Latino civil rights group is accusing Texas Republican Attorney General Ken Paxton of using election raids to intimidate voters. Next, we'll speak with the head of the largest and oldest Latino civil rights organization in America. You are streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Latino activists are calling for a federal investigation into a series of raids conducted by the Texas Attorney General's office in an effort to investigate allegations of voting improprieties. AG Ken Paxton's office said these undercover operations are happening in response to allegations that surfaced that accuse some organizations of Texas of possibly unlawfully registering non-citizens or engaging in ballot harvesting. But the League of United Latin American Citizens, or LULAC, is denouncing the raids as, quote, point-blank voter intimidation. Juan Proaño joins me now. He is the CEO of LULAC. Juan, it's great to see you. Describe what happened in these raids and what raises the highest level of concern for your organization.
Good evening, Mr. Garrett. What we heard on Thursday was very concerning to us. On Tuesday morning at 6 a.m., Lydia Martinez, a 35-year member of LULAC, was served with a search warrant. 7 to 8 police officers entered her home. They interrogated her for over 3 hours, looking for cell phones, computers, documentation relative to her voter registration efforts in San Antonio.
And what is the source of the information that led the Attorney General's office to take these actions, so far as you can tell?
There are a couple of different narratives that we're hearing, but essentially he's saying that he has started this election integrity investigation over 2 years ago. It seems like it basically goes back to a Republican candidate who lost and basically reported, voter harvesting as the result of that. There was no evidence that was provided at all whatsoever.
So these raids occurred because subpoenas were issued, and you're still trying to find out what the source material or the evidentiary basis of those subpoenas was. Is that correct?
That's correct. There have been, at least from what we can tell, about 5 different subpoenas issued as of last Tuesday. Unfortunately, it took us about 48 hours to learn of this because the victims in this particular case were told not to talk to anyone about it. They were left without cell phones, without computers. In our case, Lydia Martinez, without her appointment book, which she basically uses to track all of her doctor's appointments, prescription medicine, no way to actually even contact her family. She actually had to drive to a neighbor's home to get help reconnecting with her family.
Has there been any effort to obtain a judicial injunction on this activity?
One of the defendants, Manuel Medina, actually has. So he has a lawyer, and he has filed an injunction to stop the search of all the devices that essentially were seized during that raid. But we're working with our LULAC members to ensure that they also have legal protection and legal counsel as well.
When the Attorney General's office says, as it did in the announcement of this is just a matter of making sure that voting is legal and proper in Texas, When you hear that, what about that sounds intimidating to your organization? Or is it the way the raids were conducted?
It's not just the way that the raids were conducted. This is a pattern that the Attorney General Paxton has actually been pursuing for some time. In early June, he went after the Catholic Charities of Rio Grande Valley, a highly esteemed organization that provides support for immigrants legally in the United States. In July, he went after the Annunciation House, which is a refugee home for migrants as well. 2 weeks ago, he went after over 24 Latino nonprofit organizations that are basically serving the community. They act as the social safety net when the federal government cannot provide for these families. And just last week, he went after community leaders. So our big surprise was essentially that he's gone beyond the pale. He's going after individuals, LULAC members, Latino leaders, civic leaders, essentially in their community that are doing what they should be doing, which is engaging Latinos who are eligible to vote in these elections.
Juan, does it tell you anything about the state of play of Texas politically from the vantage point of Republicans that this activity is taking on prominence in the headlines? And how do you believe not only your organization, but those sympathetic with it in Texas are likely to respond?
There's been a huge shift in Texas, right? Today, as it stands, there are 12.1 million Hispanics in Texas. That's 39% of the population in the state of Texas. Latinos actually outnumber non-Hispanic whites in the state of Texas. And when you account for Hispanic, African American, Asian Americans, you're talking about 58% of the population of Texas are minorities. Texas is now a majority minority state, and Republicans in control are afraid that they will exercise their vote and they will vote them out of office.
Do you believe Texas in the presidential election is actually in play?
You know, there are certain specific districts that are absolutely in play, right? And so one of those search warrants was actually on a candidate that's actually running in District 60, I believe. And so there is absolutely no question that this is a voter intimidation tactic. It is an effort to threaten our community activists, our community leaders, and to also chill the Latino vote. We are writing a letter, and have written a letter, delivered a letter to the Assistant Attorney General, Kristen Clark, who's in charge of the Civil Rights Division, and we're demanding an investigation.
Juan Perano of LULAC, we thank you very much for your time. The battle for big labor as Donald Trump looks to win back union support. A closer look at how both campaigns are vying for members and the support of union leaders. You are streaming America Decides.
She's a fighter for the working class. And Donald Trump is a scam.
Welcome back to America Decides. The Harris campaign was, not surprisingly, quick to spread those words from United Auto Workers Union President Shawn Fain, doing so across their many social media pages. But will advocates like Fain actually help Harris prevent former President Trump from having a strong performance with union households, as he memorably did on his path to victory in 2016. I want to bring in CBS News investigative reporter Dan Kleidman for more. Dan, you have a piece that talks about this. First of all, express for our audience the importance of union households in the blue wall, quote-unquote, states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin.
Well, crucial. I mean, and the Harris campaign, I think, believes that the election depends on doing well enough in those states with union households. And all you have to do is look at 2016 when Donald Trump cut into Democratic margins there. Hillary Clinton did not do as well as Democrats normally do. Unions are a staple of the Democratic Party. Those few percentage points, particularly in the blue wall states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and to some degree, although a lesser extent in Wisconsin, that was the whole ball game. And then Joe Biden bounced back in 2020 with the union voters, and he won those three states. So they are absolutely crucial in 2024. Harris campaign knows that. They are focused like a laser on union voters.
And the President Biden likes to describe himself as the most pro-union president in American history. Based on your reporting, what does the Harris campaign believe her image is within union households? As strong, nearly as strong, or she has some work to do compared to President Biden?
You know, right now the polling looks like there's roughly parity between what she has now and what Joe Biden had in 2020. But, you know, that may just be because she's been part of that administration. I think she's going to have to do a lot of work to maintain that and perhaps even gain on it. Joe Biden worked for decades to cultivate that image as Scranton Joe. And he has that middle-class background that helped him connect with union voters, their aspirations and their plight. Kamala Harris is a little bit more of a cosmopolitan personality from the Bay Area, and she doesn't have that kind of emotional connection with union workers and you know, that Joe Biden had. And you know, they're doing, I think, what they need to do. I mean, the very first thing that the Harris campaign did once she became the presumed nominee was to send her into these swing states and to meet with union rank and file, the United Auto Workers. And if you paid attention to her speech in Chicago, she was nodding at working class voters throughout it. She was talking about having worked at McDonald's when she was in college. She talked about the neighborhood she grew up in, which she described as a working class neighborhood of construction workers and firefighters and nurses. And last thing, which I think is really important, the selection of Tim Walz as her running mate. He is that Midwestern, plain-speaking former football coach with the flannel shirts in the closet. They sent him out for his first solo appearance. They sent him out to L.A. To rally AFSCME rank and file workers out there. So they are being very strategic about this.
And as you well know, Dan, and I do too, having covered Trump for many, many years, he loves to talk about what he perceives, and there's some data that backs him up on this, a divide between union leadership and rank and file membership. Rank and file defies the union leadership, oftentimes in Trump's point of view, and votes for him, even though the leadership and the union itself endorses a Democrat.
That is absolutely right. And when you're talking about, you know, these tiny margins, these slivers of the electorate, if Kamala Harris gets these endorsements, but you know, small numbers of union workers, rank and file workers, don't go with the party bosses, that could be a problem.
Always about the party bosses, one way or the other. Dan Kleidman, thank you so very much. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
After Robert F. Kennedy Jr. suspended his campaign Friday, his wife, Cheryl Hines, released a statement supporting his withdrawal, but she may not be in support of her husband's decision to endorse former President Trump, as evidenced by an interview she gave earlier this year that, as you all know, because nothing dies on the internet, is now making the rounds on social media.
I have to ask, the latest speculation is that maybe you would be the VP for Trump. Would you ever do that?
I don't think that my marriage would survive it.
I think he's right.
Just president. That's all you want.
Yeah.
Trump embraced Kennedy's support during his rally in Glendale, Arizona, Friday, calling him, quote, a great person. But not too long ago, the Republican presidential nominee described his former rival, well, let's just say much differently.
RFK, I don't know anything about him. Look, RFK is polling very low. He's not a serious candidate. He's a disaster. He's radical left. RFK Jr. is radical left. He reminds me of this fly that's driving me crazy up here. He's a fake. He's a fake. He's a total fake. You don't want to. He's more liberal than Joe Biden and all of these communists that work for him. Kennedy's more liberal than all of them.
Conclusion, at least Cheryl Hines and former President Trump probably agree on one thing, that consistency and politics, well, they just might be mutually exclusive. That does it for today. We will be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report with John Dickerson starts right now.